نتمشى مع براين لك يلا تمشى مع براين لكم نتمشى مع براين. العوافي يا جماعة and welcome to another episode of اتمشى مع براين. أكيد مثل ما لاحظتوا إنه اليوم غير عن بقية الابيسودز. We started with what I'm trialing as the new theme song or theme intro for the podcast. So أكيد I want to hear your thoughts about it in the comments or just Instagram, whatever it is. So please let me know what you guys think, because I think it fits well with the podcast. Kind of embodies what this is about. مثل ما بتعرفوا قبل ما نبلش حلقتنا اليوم وقبل ما نبلش كل حلقة بنبلش بنكتة بايخة. والنكتة البايخة تبع اليوم هي في مرة واحد راح ضبي أما أنا رحت عضيت له بيو. صرت قايلها النكتة لحالي شي 4 مرات وكل مرة بقولها I die of laughter. And for those of you, it's exclusively Lebanese in some way, because Dubai is a area in Lebanon, so someone that's not Lebanese wouldn't get it at first, I think. بس انه still المضمون نفسه ذاته. واحد راح على دبي انا رحت عضيت له بيو. And so moving on to the theme of today's podcast. Now, I kind of already mentioned in last week's episode what the intent is, and so today's episode is about none other than Christopher Nolan. And for those of you who don't know Christopher Nolan is, please listen in. You're gonna be in for a wonderful ride and journey into knowing this beautiful film director. So to start off, let's talk a little bit about Christopher Nolan. So he's a movie director. He's directed a lot of amazing movies, including Memento, The Prestige, Interstellar, Inception, Dunkirk, and even Batman. And he's done exceptionally well in all of those. So the funny thing is that Christopher Nolan never studied cinematography. He actually went to school to study English. And he was into novels and what narrative freedom they give to the story that they're writing. And while he was at uni studying English, he got interested into the cinema club, and that I think is what introduced him into the world of cinema. He enjoyed the work he was doing, he enjoyed working in cinema, and he started through the cinema club kind of learning the secrets of the trade and figuring out how to actually make a movie. And then I think it was in the year 1998 Nolan actually made his first movie, but that movie, which was called The Following, was self-funded, so he wasn't endorsed by any big studios or anything like that. He did everything. He funded the whole movie. He found a way to be able to fund it. He filmed it all in his friends' apartments. He used whatever equipment he could borrow from the university and practically made his own movie from scratch. And I think that was what kind of showed his capabilities, and having people see that movie and the result that it came up with, he got his first breakthrough. Now, his first breakthrough is an amazing movie called Memento. Now, there's a section in this podcast later on where we will be talking specifically about the movies or some movies and what makes them great. But Memento, in short, is about this guy who has short-term memory loss, and he tries to figure out who killed his wife using Polaroids and tattoos that he put on his body. It's an amazing movie, and we'll delve into that deeper. But that was his breakthrough into Hollywood. So he made Memento, and from there he just blew up. And the movies that he made afterwards got him 8 Oscar nominations. And his last movie, which is Oppenheimer, actually won him 2, Best Picture and Best Director. And His movies are just known worldwide. They grossed like somewhere between $6 billion. Um, Three of his movies, which are Memento, Dunkirk, and Memento, The Dark Knight, and Inception, all of those were actually stored in the U.S. Library of Congress as items of history and culture, and that just tells you a lot. But not only that, the accolades don't stop there. His career was so great that in 2024 he was knighted by the King, King Charles, and therefore since then he's been known as Sir Christopher Nolan. So you can see that the accolades and what he's actually acquired over the years because of his work are a testament to how good of a director he actually is. Now, what is it about Nolan or Christopher Nolan that makes him different to everyone else? And before we start talking about the movies and the ideas he tackles in those movies, let's talk a little bit about like the technical side or the technicalities of Nolan that make him different from everyone else. And the first is that Nolan doesn't use CGI. He doesn't use computer generated imagery in his movies. He hates the idea of CGI. He believes that CGI doesn't really blend well or age well. And for all the movies that he required these big scenes or these massive scenes, he used to get props. And for example, one of his movies, Tenant, he needed a plane to crash into a hangar, and so he bought a plane and crashed it into a hangar full on. And in Inception, for anyone who's watched it, there's a scene where there's like a rotating hallway. That wasn't done in CGI. That was a full actual rotating hallway. And it's a rotating set where all the actors were like hung with strings and everything like that. So you can see he was someone that wanted to make sure that the practical effects or the stunts that were being done in the movie were actually genuinely done, not computer generated, because of that idea that he had that any of this computer generated imagery would not age well, especially as we can see in the advancements. You'd watch a movie that 20 years ago or 10 years ago was amazing in terms of the computer graphics that it had, and you look at and you look at it today and you go like, shit, that's outdated. Today's computer imagery is way better. And so that's the thing that he wanted to remove, and that's why all of his movies, even till today, you watch them, you don't have that glaring thing that pops into your face where it's like, oh, this does look old, because it's all filmed, it's all actually done, all the stunts are there, all the techniques are there. So he's, I think, a pioneer in that retrospective, just choosing not to use CGI. Another thing that makes Nolan stand out over everyone else is that he uses exclusively IMAX cameras or IMAX film cameras for his movie sets. And for those of you who don't know, IMAX film cameras are very expensive. There's only a few of them, and they were solely used for nature documentaries. They were used for documentaries because they immerse you into the scene that you're seeing. The colors are different, the range of motion is different, and the amount of detail that can come out from an IMAX camera was just insane. And so when he saw that, he was like, why don't I incorporate that camera into movie making, and therefore allowing people to get more immersed in the movie that they're watching as well? So why does it just have to be documentaries? And that's also something that makes him stand out over everyone else, is that ensuring that the quality of the image and the immersion in the movie was optimal. And that's why he chose to use IMAX cameras for these. And he went extreme with them. Like he in Dunkirk, he actually like bolted one of those cameras to a Spitfire warplane and was filming during those flight maneuvers. And even in Oppenheimer, he did something also kind of innovative and new, which is he used IMAX cameras to film black and white. So that's also something that he was the first one to do, and obviously it panned out. The movie won Best Picture. Like, this is just some of the details that kind of help build why Christopher Nolan was so good and is still so good as a movie director. He also did everything himself. He didn't have like multiple film crews going around. It was him shooting every frame, making sure that every frame that he pictured was the way he wanted it. So basically, someone that's in control of the whole process of creating the movie. And that's something I think that is or contributes to why his movies are so great. And also, one last thing before we start delving into the movies that Nolan does, which is great, is that he understands that a movie soundtrack is not something that's separate from the movie, but something that's intertwined into it. And that's why he always got the best composers to make his movies. So, for example, for Batman, for Inception, for Interstellar, and for Dunkirk, he used Hans Zimmer. And Hans Zimmer is one of the best known composers in the world. And as evidenced by that, the soundtracks that he made for those movies are so memorable, but that some people listen to them or use them even today. Like, for example, I'll give you one. Even if you haven't watched the movies, I'll just mime out one right now, and you'll know the song. It's from Interstellar, and it just goes like dun 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 dun, and then like that's Hans Zimmer. And that's only because Nolan was like, I need the soundtrack to this movie to be as great as the movie itself. And so he got Hans Zimmer. And then later on, he even got Ludwig Göransson, sorry, who made soundtracks for two of his movies, Tenet and Oppenheimer. And that soundtrack for Oppenheimer won Best Original Score in the Oscars that year. So you can see that the level of contribution you need to work with Nolan was needed to be at the same level that he was. He didn't just forego something. He would wait to acquire the right person because he knew that that right person or that right soundtrack or Hans Zimmer or Ludwig Göransson were the people that he needed to get the best or optimal result. And these are things I think that are what or the characteristics that make Nolan different to everyone else in terms of like his movies and everything that he did. So small things that you focus on, and you could say it's like some form of perfectionism where he wants to make sure that the product that's going out there is the product that he wants, and he wants it this way, with this composer, with this music. And there's so many instances where you have interviews with Hans Zimmer going like, you'd have, like for example, Nolan write the movie and then have a script, and then he'd send the script to Hans Zimmer, and they'd sit down together kind of analyzing what the emotional intent was behind each scene, so that then Hans can like start generating the soundtrack to that. And that just shows you the level of immersion that Nolan has, the level of passion that he has for his work. And I think that's the thing that makes him stand out over everyone else in the movie industry, and why he's got so many accolades. And now that we've talked about kind of the general aspects of Nolan, we're gonna start talking about his movies and what makes, or some of his movies, and what makes them so great. So the first thing, in all of Nolan's films, regardless of the story, he was always tackling a huge idea or a controversial idea or a controversial thought. Like the topics of his movies were time, memory, identity, the subconscious, space travel, everything like that. So he used to choose challenging topics and use his story to narrate that topic or the effect of that thing. And that's one of the things that made his movies so great. So the first one is Memento. So Memento, he released that in the year 2000. And like I said, it was his first movie, his first breakthrough movie. And the idea behind it was he wanted to talk about memory, and how sometimes what we actually think is memory is not actually memory. It's a certain instance that our brain has changed or misinterpreted or reinterpreted to fit a story or a scenario that we have. And the idea behind that was to show, like, is it is it is it genuine that you can rely on your memory sometimes, or do you need to be aware that sometimes your brain can play a trick on you, and it can actually morph a memory to suit the narrative or the story that you want. So the idea behind the movie was that there was this guy, his wife was murdered, and this guy suffers from short-term memory loss, so every day he'd wake up forgetting the things he had done the day before. And so what he did in order to kind of help himself piece together the mystery of who killed his wife, he tattooed all of his body with signs and signals and little hints, and then he took Polaroids and he used those to be able to kind of figure out who the actual killer of his wife was. And one of the things that makes this movie so great is just like the main character who doesn't know what's going on. So he's every day basically trying to go through the same journey to figure out who this wife killer is, and every time he'd get one more piece of evidence, and it would either be he'd either staple that in the form of a tattoo or a Polaroid picture. And the great thing about this movie is that you are experiencing the same thing that the main character in the movie is. You're trying to figure out what's going on. You're trying to figure out who the killer is in the same method. So it immerses you even further, having to actually undergo the journey itself, not just watch it from afar. And one of the most interesting things about this movie is that this movie was actually filmed in sequence, so in proper time, but then it was edited in reverse. And throughout the whole movie, you're just constantly jumping between two timelines. One is what he thinks he remembers, or what his photos and tattoos remind him of, and the other is what's actually going on. So you're constantly jumping between those two things, and that also is something that Nolan intended to do, because it kind of provided the same distortion or the same kind of disorientation that the main character had to the audience. So you don't know how to, you're constantly battling these two timelines and trying to figure out how they both meet to figure out who the killer is. So I think Memento is definitely one to watch, and honestly I think it's my favorite Nolan movie. Following that, there's a great movie called The Prestige. So also one of the things that Nolan does is that he always gets top actors, like genuine professionals, to act in his movies. And in The Prestige, it talks about two magicians. One is played by Hugh Jackman, the other is played by Christian Bale. And in this movie, what he's trying to show, or the story he's trying to narrate, is that there's these two magicians, and they're both in pursuit of the perfect illusion. And that illusion is kind of a disappearing act. And the idea or the topic that Nolan wanted to tackle in that movie was the thought of identity. Like, what is identity and when do you lose it? And so the two magicians, one of them secretly lives a double life where he has a twin who no one knows about, and he uses that to be able to create the perfect illusion, while the other uses a Tesla machine to clone himself every time he wants to go the trick or do that disappearing act. And then he would get rid of the clone or kill the clone or whatever it is. And that's the topic that Nolan wanted to tackle. It was the thought of identity and how much deception is acceptable to entertain an audience. Like, at what point are you sacrificing so much of who you are in order to achieve the illusion or to please the audience? And so that was the topic of that movie. It was the thought of identity and what actually creates an identity, and how much change or how much stuff do you have to do to actually start losing that, and when does it stop becoming valuable? So also a very great movie. It's called The Prestige, like I was saying. Following that, one movie that I think most of you guys that are listening in would know this movie. It's called Inception. And the idea that Nolan wanted to tackle in Inception was the subconscious, and how there's thoughts that we don't know about that are generally swarming through our head, and that they are manifested by our subconscious. And what he was trying to figure out is how to narrate that story well, and to talk about how we disregard our subconscious, but sometimes you need to delve in there to understand what you generally feel and your thoughts. And as evidenced by this, this movie actually took 10 years to make. So the idea came to Nolan very early on about creating this movie, but he wanted to fine tune it to make sure that he was achieving the result that he wanted, and that the story was manifested in the way he wanted it to. And so the basic, the like the bare bones of this movie is that it rotates around dreams, and how dreams are usually a manifestation of our subconscious. So that's why people sometimes have their dreams interpreted, because the messages that they see in those dreams could mean something that their subconscious is thinking about, or an issue that they have that they're not acknowledging, but their subconscious is saying, like, you need to tackle this, you need to acknowledge this. And so that's why he chose the idea of dreams to illustrate the idea of the subconscious. And he goes through a delve into the idea of dreams, where in the movie you have people going going from dream into another dream into another dream, which is why it's called Inception. It's the inception of an idea. And so he's trying to use delving into dreams to change something in that dream, and therefore alter the subconscious and make people want something that they didn't think they wanted, or to change people's opinions of something. It's a very, very diverse topic, and it's very interesting to see. And for those of you who haven't watched Inception, please go watch it, because it's just such a unique idea. And in an interview once, this is also kind of a little tidbit about this movie. In an interview once, Christopher Nolan was being asked about how the idea of Inception came to him. And so he told them that when he was at uni, he was relying on the university, because he studied in the UK, and a lot of universities in the UK usually they house their students, and you basically live on campus. And so when he was going through uni, he was relying on the campus for food and everything like that. And he'd say that he'd usually stay up late working or studying or doing whatever it is, but then breakfast was always served at 6 a.m. So he'd have to wake up in order to make it in time to get breakfast, and then go back to sleep. And so the idea was that he started forgetting when, or the instances that happened to him, whether they were when he was awake or when he was asleep, because in that moment when he was having breakfast, he was in that kind of middle state between being awake and being asleep. And so that's how the idea manifested to him. And you could see that, when a director or when someone generates an idea or a movie from a personal experience, it usually comes from a very, very powerful standpoint, as we can see in Inception. So for those of you, I think I've said this the third time, for those of you who haven't watched Inception, watch it. Actually, at the end of this podcast, every movie that I'm talking about, please watch, and then afterwards watch all of his other movies, because he is just that good, my man. And then the movie that comes next is also one that I think all of you know, and I've already talked about quite a bit in the start, which is Interstellar. So this is where Nolan shifted kind of the range of his ideas. So before, he was dealing with the earthly scale of ideas, like the self, identity, memory, subconscious. And then he wanted to go to a cosmic scale. And the topic he chose was time. So the movie is centered on the idea of time, and how time and how, like the process of time dilation. So time dilation is basically the idea that time can be morphed or changed um, with via gravity. So gravity itself could slow down and speed up time. And so in this movie, he illustrates that by when, like for example, the main character. Again, this movie starring amazing people. So you've got Matthew McConaughey and Michael Caine and Anne Hathaway. And in the previous movie, which I was talking about, which was Inception, you had Leonardo DiCaprio, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Tom Hardy, Cillian Murphy, amazing actors. And so in Interstellar, the idea was that the main character, Matthew McConaughey, has to leave the planet in order to go to another planet to save humanity. And that other planet had a varying gravitational pull to Earth. And so by the time he went there and came back to Earth, his younger daughter was older than he was. And that's kind of the punchline of the whole movie, because the reason why he was doing this was to save Earth, to save life, and basically preserve Earth for his daughter. And so having done this, he came back only to realize that his daughter is older than he was. And it's a gut-wrenching movie. It's an amazing movie, and I recommend all of you to watch it. I know I'm I'm like spilling some beans on some of these movies to tell you how great they are, but it doesn't take away, they don't take away from the grandeur and the amazing things about these movies. Sorry. So if you haven't watched Interstellar, please go watch it. And one of the most interesting things about Interstellar, and this truly shows how dedicated Nolan is to his craft, is that when he was discovering the galactic scale and talking about gravity, he wanted to render or kind of create an image of a black hole. And so a black hole is basically a void of gravity, so it pulls everything in, and they're found all over our galaxy. But he didn't know how to kind of generally figure out the idea, so he enlisted one of the most famous or renowned physicists out there. His name is Kip Thorne, and together they kind of figured out what a black hole actually would look like. And they delved so deep, and they made sure that they could get it as accurate as possible, that after the movie was released, that physicist, Kip Thorne, actually wrote two scientific peer-reviewed papers on black holes because of what they manifested in that movie, because of what he discovered when he was going on this trip with Nolan. When they delved deeper into the idea of what a black hole looks like, it inspired him to write these physics papers. And that just shows you again the scale of where Nolan works, how he works, and kind of the level of what he wants to achieve. He didn't just say it was this and or it looks like this and that's it. He actually wanted to be as accurate as possible. And like I was saying, he was so accurate that he actually managed to inspire this physicist into writing two papers about this. And these are kind of and these are kind of 5 of my favorite movies for Christopher Nolan, and truly some of his most inspirational work. Now obviously, like I stated in the start, there's a lot more, but these show you how deep he goes in there. Sorry, these are 4 movies. There's one more that I'm going to be talking about, sorry. But yeah, these are already kind of showing you how much dedication this guy has to his art. And the last movie that I'm going to talk about is Dunkirk. So Dunkirk is a movie that talks about an event that happened on Dunkirk beach during World War II. So the event that happened during that battle was called Operation Dynamo. And basically Operation Dynamo was the evacuation of almost 340,000 soldiers from Dunkirk beach. and they were surrounded by the Germans on all sides, so they couldn't go inland, and they were stuck on the shore, and they were constantly being bombed. And it talks about that event during World War II. Now, the thing that Nolan did was he refused to follow the stereotype of traditional war movies. So he had no heroes, he had no backstory, there was almost no blood or no big battle scenes, and he just, everything that was expected of a typical war movie, he drove away from that. And instead, the way he chose to narrate this movie was via three different timelines. So he chose to, the three different timelines were 1 week on the beach, on Dunkirk beach, 1 day in the boats that were coming into Dunkirk beach to evacuate the people, the soldiers, and 1 hour in the air. And they were interwoven beautifully. So like you were watching the time span of 1 week on the beach, you were watching the time span of 1 day in the boats, and you were watching the time span of 1 hour in the air in a plane, all interwoven beautifully to tell the story of how that operation happened and how it resulted in the evacuation of all of those soldiers during World War II. And that again shows you how Nolan is a pioneer. He refused to work in the stereotype. He refused to follow the typical blueprint of what a war movie should be. Instead, he chose to do it his own way, and he did it so beautifully that, as I stated in the beginning of the podcast, that it was just an exceptional movie, and it got a lot of Oscar nominations as well. And also, one of the things that made this movie stand out was, we talked about earlier how Nolan loved using IMAX cameras, and so he actually bolted or mounted an IMAX camera to one of the Spitfire warplanes and used it to film it during aerial maneuvers. So he wanted the full immersion to make you feel like you were in the cockpit of that plane, and to understand the emotions and the story from the perspective of the pilot of that plane. He filmed on the beach, which is very common in movies which are about history or historical events, but he did it in such a beautiful way, filming on Dunkirk beach. And the last thing that he did, which stands out very well, is that he cast teenagers to play the main roles in that movie, because he knew, if you read the history books, you know that during World War II, during World War II, the people that were enlisted in the war were kids, they were teenagers. That's how much they needed soldiers. And so he took that true fact and manifested it in the movie, where in a lot of other war movies you have older actors that are pretending or acting like they're teenagers or young soldiers, but the reality of what Nolan wanted to do, he needed teenagers, he needed the genuine image to come out, and therefore he hired teenagers and cast them to play the main roles in that movie. And Dunkirk was so good, and still is so good, that it dethroned Saving Private Ryan as the top-selling best World War II movie to date. So that just shows you. And for anyone who hasn't watched Saving Private Ryan, watch it. Or for those who have watched it, you know how good of a movie that is, and you know what it takes for a movie to be better. And that's what Nolan did. He chose the perfect way to illustrate that story, and therefore created the best World War II movie out there. And now that we've talked about like 5 of his biggest movies and how they show why Nolan is so great, Christopher Nolan for me is a very, very special director. And that's because of a series he did about Batman. Now, Batman is by far my favorite superhero, whether we're talking about DC or Marvel or anything like that. And I think everyone around the world knows who Batman is. And so I think it was the year 1997 where a movie called Batman and Robin was released. It had, I think it was George Clooney and someone else in there playing Batman. And it failed. It failed so bad that people started considering that this might be the end of Batman on screen and that there was no more point in making movies about Batman. And that's when Nolan got handed the keys. So 2005, they gave him the keys and they were like, we want you to make the new Batman movie. And there comes Batman Begins, the first of 3 movies in a trilogy. And it was and still is my favorite superhero movie, and one that's regarded as the best when it comes to talking about superhero movies or any action movie itself. And Batman Begins actually talks about the story of the inception or the creation or how Batman came to be. And again, in this movie, you've got Christian Bale, you've got Liam Neeson, you've got actors that are, again, Michael Caine playing Alfred, and Christian Bale is Batman. So he's the one that stays true and is the main character throughout the 3 movies. And in this movie, it talks about how Batman came to be, like the death of his parents, how he got trained by the League of Assassins, and how he chose to deviate from that path and turn into Batman, and then how he battled the League of Shadows himself. And the thing that Nolan wanted to do in that movie was that he wanted the idea of Batman to be real, to be grounded, and to be sort of psychological, and to show that the idea of becoming Batman might seem impossible or might seem imaginary or might seem like fiction, but the reality of it is not that it could happen. Like, he made it seem like any other guy that went through the same circumstances as Bruce Wayne, who is Batman, in those movies, could actually turn into Batman themselves if they underwent that same methodology and if they had a shit ton of money, obviously. That's that's basically one of the things that Batman is known for. Not only is because he's such an amazing superhero, but because his alter ego Bruce Wayne is just a rich millionaire, and that's how he became Batman, or how he was able to create Batman. And so after Batman Begins, you have The Dark Knight. This was 2008 released, and I think The Dark Knight is the staple of what a superhero movie should be, and every superhero movie that came afterwards looks up to that and uses it as a reference. So this one tells the story of Batman Begins, actually talks about the battle between Batman and the Joker, who is his biggest villain. So every superhero has their biggest villain, and the biggest villain that the Batman has is the Joker. And in this movie, the Joker was played by none other than Australian actor Heath Ledger. And I think Heath put on what is known as kind of the greatest screen performance in history, from my view, in a superhero movie. He played the role of Joker so well and so good that, unfortunately, that year, Heath Ledger passed away. But because he did such an amazing job and such a great performance in that movie, in Batman Begins, in The Dark Knight, he won an Oscar after his death. So the Oscars happened after the tragic event of his passing, and they still handed him the Oscar for Best Actor for what he did in that movie. And that just shows you the quality of the actors that Nolan gets. Obviously, Heath Ledger is just an amazing actor altogether. But it shows you the kind of quality that Nolan requires in his movies, that even the villain, not the main character, but the villain of this movie needs to be played at an exceptional level. And that's what Heath Ledger did. And then it's just, it just got better afterwards. So after we had Batman Begins, we had The Dark Knight, and the third and final movie came out in 2012. It was called The Dark Knight Rises. And in this one, the villain is Bane, played by Tom Hardy, who till today also is a very memorable and powerful performance. Like anyone that knows the the franchise knows who Bane is and how well he was played by Tom Hardy. Again, Christian Bale as Batman, Michael Caine as his assistant, and his carer Alfred. And it talked about the story of kind of the resurrection of Batman. So Batman, him, Bruce Wayne, Christian Bale, whoever it is, they went through the process of kind of defeat. And this one shows you how Batman like rises from that defeat. But not only that, the way Nolan kind of wrote and manifested that movie, it kind of tied the story of Batman or the story of the trilogy with a nice little bow on top. Um, Having defeated Bane, which is his most formidable foe after the Joker. Um, and the reason why Christopher Nolan's adaptation of Batman was so good that even 20 years after, like we talked about 2005, we're in 2026, 21 years after, those movies and that movie, Batman Begins, are still considered as a top contender to the best superhero movie. And whatever conversation you're talking about when it comes to superhero movies, those movies are just immediately, automatically in because of how good they were. And Batman is a character that I grew up watching. I watched cartoons of Batman, I read comics of Batman, and I watched so many movies on Batman. So to have someone generally create such a beautiful masterpiece for Batman, just for me, automatically puts him as one of my favorite directors. And he actually did just that with that movie. So if you haven't watched any of the Batman movies, please do. If you don't know where they are, I'll show you. If you want, like, I don't even mind coming and watching them with you guys, whoever wants to, because I can never grow tired of these movies and I can just watch them over and over and over again. So please go watch the Batman trilogy that Nolan made. And I think with that, we've come to the end of our podcast today in our episode talking about Christopher Nolan. And I just like to say that what made Nolan so great is not just the awards and the accolades that he acquired over the years and the fact that he was knighted by the king and he's won 2 Oscars, nominated for so many, and these are just the top accolades. We haven't talked about all the small ones that he won across the way, but it's the fact that Nolan himself refused to compromise. He refused to settle for the ordinary, but always chose the extraordinary. He always picked the most challenging topics to discuss and to kind of make the center of his movies. And he did them so well that those topics and that movie became cinematic masterpieces. And whether we're talking about Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, The Prestige, Memento, and so much more. Just the Batman trilogy itself is worth so much. And the reason I actually chose to talk about Nolan, or had Nolan on my mind for the past couple of weeks, is that because he's now working on The Odyssey. So The Odyssey is the story about Odysseus. It's about Greek mythology. It's the story about Odysseus after the Battle of Troy and his journey back to Ithaca, to home, and all the challenges and the trials that he had to go through in order to get back home. And for any of you who's listened to this podcast for what's today, the 26th episode, you know my love for Greek mythology. And to have Greek mythology being done by Christopher Nolan, for me, is like having Batman done by Christopher Nolan. I honestly can't wait. There's a lot of criticism going around, there's a lot of this and that, but that's always been the case with Christopher Nolan movies. I'm still very excited to watch this movie, and I know it'll be a masterpiece. Also, the actors there, like Matt Damon, Zendaya, Tom Holland, Robert Patterson, just the cast is amazing, and so I have high hopes for what this movie is going to be, especially because there's a giant in the story of Odysseus, and I don't know how Nolan's going to do that without using CGI, but I'm very excited to see it. And so, with that, we get to the closing of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the topic of Christopher Nolan and his movies. And like I said, if you haven't watched any of the movies that I've talked about, it's okay. Just you can do it now. Go pick one of those movies. Any one of the movies that I talked about today, if you choose to watch it, I guarantee you will not be disappointed, and you will realize how much of a cinematic masterpiece it is, and how great Nolan is at doing his job. ومع يا جماعة, I think we come to the end of today's podcast, and I'd like to thank all of you for listening, all of you for the support, and I say goodbye وهيك وشكرا.